The Russian invasion in Ukraine and the war that is taking place has been a foregone outcome of a long-time conflict that has its roots back in the past. The starting point of the whole situation goes back to the overthrow of socialism and the dissolution of the Soviet Union 30 years ago. The restoration of capitalism became the source of all evils, in the meaning that it resurrected the bourgeois competitions. It cultivated the ground for the emergence of capitalists, also known as oligarchs, who acquired significant economic and political power, but also revived nationalist enmity between the people. Following the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the newly formed bourgeoisie of Russia sought the socio-political consolidation of its power. For a period of approximately 17 years, during the 1990s and up to 2007-2008, the Russian bourgeoisie, led by Boris Yeltsin and later by Vladimir Putin, avoided an open front against the West. In fact, it turned a blind eye to many moves made by the Euro-Atlantic forces, which were promoting their own interests of the monopolies in the region of Europe and Eurasia. That happened because the Russian capitalism was in a stage of development that was not able to challenge the dominance of the Western powers. However, through the years, Russia's bourgeois class stabilized and strengthened its authority both internally and abroad. Russian monopoly groups accumulated capital and expanded their business significantly. When the Russian ruling class, the Russian capital, became powerful enough, it sought to regain lost ground in the competition with Western monopolies and their imperialist alliances, namely NATO and the EU. We remind, for example, the 2008 crisis in Georgia, which led to the annexation of Abkhazia and South Ossetia by Moscow. The next crisis in this power struggle between Russia and the West took place in Ukraine with the 2014 coup and the violent overthrow of the Yanukovych government. For at least a decade now, the people of Ukraine have been paying the price for the competition and interventions over the division of markets and spheres of influence between, on one hand, the Euro-Atlantic powers, the United States, NATO, and the European Union, and on the other hand, the strategy of capitalist Russia. The Euro-Atlantic powers promote the strategy of the so-called Euro-Atlantic enlargement, the expansion of NATO, while capitalist Russia aims to strengthen its own imperialist coalition, like the Eurasian Economic Union, like the Collective Security Treaty Organization within the former Soviet region. The Russian military intervention in Ukraine in essence marks the formal beginning of a war that has been prepared over time. As we said, the focus is set on the division of mineral wealth, energy, land, workforce, pipelines, commodity transportation networks, geopolitical mainstays, and market shares. For years now, the United States, NATO, and the EU have been systematically attempting and promoting the economic, political, and military encirclement of Russia by intervening, deploying powerful military forces, and establishing military bases, thus adding fuel to the fire. We must remind that after the Warsaw Pact was broken, NATO not only did not dissolve or become limited, but on the contrary, it has been enlarged, it has been expanded, including in its ranks other Eastern European countries and former Soviet republics. It stations military forces, bases, and modern weapons in various regions around Russia. And of course, for years now, military plans, drills, and exercises that are targeting Russia take place in the North Sea, Eastern Europe, the Black Sea, and the Baltic. The latest developments in Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine is the most recent incident of a long-term confrontation about Ukraine. And this confrontation is also related to a fierce competition within the Ukraine's bourgeoisie, which was formed after the overthrow of socialism, and the competition has to do with whether or not the country would join one or the other imperialist alliance. In the framework of this confrontation, on one hand, the USA, NATO, and the EU, together with sections of the Ukrainian bourgeois class, supported and organized the Orange Revolution in 2004, as well as the bloody coup in 2014, utilizing and supporting far-right fascist forces like the Azov Battalion, aiming to establish a pro-Western regime. On the other hand, Russia seized parts of the Ukrainian territory through the annexation of Crimea, through the support towards the Russian-speaking separatists in the Donbass region, and of course by recognizing their state entity, the state entity of Donetsk and Lugansk, shortly before its intervention. All these events, of course, which are unfolding 30 years after the counter-revolution and the overthrow of socialism in the Soviet Union, are the tragic and concrete proof of the historic setback that took place in early 1990s. This momentum setback for the peoples of the region, but also for the working class in all over the world, opened the Pandora's box. The capitalist restoration, among other things, has led to the division of peoples and states, as it happens, for example, in the cases of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, due to the competition among the bourgeois classes over the control of markets, raw materials, geostrategic positions, and transportation routes. The bourgeois classes and the capitalists that emerged in the course of capitalist restoration, stealing the hard-won achievements by the United Soviet people over decades, were formed through a process of counter-revolution. And the governments of Vladimir Putin in Russia, as well as the government of Zelensky in Ukraine, express the interests of those capitalists. That is why, after all, despite their differences and rivalries, they concur in anti-communism. They concur in the falsification of history. They concur in slandering the Soviet Union and in strengthening nationalism, both in Russia and Ukraine. The invocation of anti-fascism by the current government of Russia in order to advance its geopolitical plans in the region is pretextual and is taking advantage of the strong anti-fascist sentiment of the Russian people and the peoples of the region who suffered millions of deaths in the struggle against the fascist Nazi German occupation and atrocity. We do not forget that capitalist Russia itself, which is at the front line of anti-communism today, maintains friendly relations with numerous far-right groups in many countries, and that Russia's leadership and Vladimir Putin himself publicly praises the ideologies of Russian fascism. At the same time, we do not forget that in 2014, fascist and far-right forces unleashed a pogrom of violence and intimidation. They committed murders and massacres, such as the one in Odessa, with, of course, the support of NATO and the European Union. The people of Ukraine, people of Russia, like all other people in the region, had been living together for 70 years within the framework of the Soviet Union. They had established their own power. They fought against imperialist interventions. They strove to utilize the land, the factories, and the wealth of their countries under relations of social ownership. They fought against the enmity and war of their old exploiters who sabotaged the steps made by the Soviet power. They advanced together in the framework of socialism. And of course, they jointly fought against Nazism, fascism, and German imperialism in World War II. The nationalist hysteria of war must not obscure the collective memory of the people of Ukraine and Russia, who had been living in brotherhood for decades. Now, 30 years after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, all those who celebrated the overthrow of socialism and promised a world of peace, security, freedom, and justice have been completely refuted. Their world, what they called the world of Western values, is a world of barbarity, a world of exploitation, a world of wars that create refugee flows, economic crisis, hundreds of thousands of victims due to military interventions. It is a world, we can say, a world of monsters, a world that comes from the capitalist system itself. Political leaders such as Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, Zelensky, and others are part of this world, of the capitalist world, and together with all the authoritarian or democratic ones who defend the freedom of the few to determine the fate of the many, and constitute different aspects of the dictatorship of capital. The imperialist war that is being waged in Ukraine today is nothing more than another link in this bloody chain of wars and rivalries that escalated particularly after 1991, losing their former ideological mantle that ostensibly defended the so-called Western free world from communist totalitarianism. The new element here is that now they're expanding into European soil since the Soviet shield no longer exists. We do not forget the wars in Yugoslavia in the beginning of the 1990s, which began with the European Union's seal of approval and led to the imperialist intervention of NATO in 1999, resulting in the final dismemberment of the country and its fragmentation. The pretexts used back then by NATO and the EU are quite the same as the ones used by capitalist Russia for its military intervention in Ukraine, and these pretexts are the protection from ethnic cleansing, or pretexts like the right to self-determination. We do not forget also the imperialist intervention and wars in the Middle East, in North Africa, the wars in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya and Afghanistan, as well as the ongoing Israeli occupation of Palestine. The United States, NATO, and their allies have dragged the people into civil wars. They have triggered ethnic and religious conflicts. They have intervened militarily, established occupation armies in the name of democracy and freedom. They led entire countries to chaos and gave rise to the reinforcement of reactionary forces like jihadists and others in the Middle East. And of course, we do not forget the role of the United States and NATO in the Turkish invasion and occupation of Cyprus in 1974, which remains an ongoing crime against the Cypriot people. Unfortunately, a number of communist parties and left-wing forces have failed to draw proper conclusions from the inter-imperialist conflict in Ukraine. A few of them went so far as to refer to the Russian invasion as a legal military action. It becomes clear that those forces that adopt such views fail to understand that alliances in the imperialist system are temporal, constantly changing, exactly like power relations. It is not in the duties of the communist movement to attempt to play any role in the relations between the imperialists by taking the side of one or the other. The working class, in case it is conscious, will not support any group of imperialistic predators, Vladimir Lenin was writing, while in his exceptional work titled Under a False Flag, he was underlining present-day democracy will remain true to itself only if it joins neither one nor the other imperialist bourgeoisie, only if it says that the two sides are equally bad, and if it wishes the defeat of the imperialist bourgeoisie in every country. Any other decision, Lenin was writing, will in reality be national liberal and have nothing in common with genuine internationalism. In reality, there can now be no talk of present-day democracy following in the way of the reactionary imperialist bourgeoisie, no matter of what shade the latter may be. The perception of supporting the least aggressive imperialist is totally anti-Leninist and against the people's and the working class interests. Of course, there is no doubt that NATO is the most criminal, the most barbaric imperialist alliance since the Second World War, with dozens of bloody interventions in the Middle East, in the Balkans, in North Africa and elsewhere. Yes, of course, the United States governments, with the complicity of the European Union, have been and remain the number one enemy for human peace. Yes, certainly, the struggle against the imperialist alliances of NATO and the EU is more timely and necessary than ever. But all these things do not negate the objective role of capitalist Russia as a powerful imperialist power that competes with the Euro-Atlantic bloc. And as such, as an imperialist power, Russia is also an enemy of the interests of the working class. There is a fundamental conclusion of all this, and this conclusion is the following. The working class, the people, have nothing to gain from the victory of one or the other imperialist power. The essential thing that we must have in mind in any war is which social class conducts it, for what purpose, and at what stage of historical development. This is the only compass for the communist movement, to utilize historical experience and interpret reality with the invaluable Marxist-Leninist theory as a guiding thread.